Risk assessment and risk analysis. The Solomon Fadun, Risk Management of Everything channel, presents risk assessment versus risk analysis. The difference between risk analysis and risk assessment. Welcome to the Solomon Fadun, Risk Management of Everything channel. On this channel, you will see videos on risk management and the application of risk management to diverse areas and sectors. If you are new here, subscribe to our channel and press the notification button to notify you when we upload new videos. Thank you. This video discusses risk assessment and risk analysis. In this video, you will understand the meaning of hazard, risk management, risk assessment, the difference between risk and hazard, the importance of risk assessment, the goals of risk assessment, when should a risk assessment be done, how to prepare for a risk assessment process, risk analysis, importance of risk analysis, the benefits of risk analysis, qualitative versus quantitative risk analysis, the difference between qualitative and quantitative risk analysis, steps in the risk analysis process, and the critical difference between risk analysis and risk assessment. Now, let us start. Understanding the differences between risk assessment and analysis helps ensure clear expectations of a risk management process. Risk management encompasses the entire process from identification to monitoring risk. In contrast, risk assessment primarily focuses on identifying and analyzing risk, and risk analysis quantifies the risk. Risk assessment and risk analysis are related terms, but they are different. As the two terms are related, it is easy to confuse them. However, they each have a distinct definition, and understanding their differences is essential. Let us start with the description of hazards and risks. What is a hazard? Hazard refers to anything that has the potential to cause harm, such as a chemical, machinery, or biological agent. A hazard is a potential source of harm or adverse health effect on a person or persons. It is something that does not directly cause damage but has the potential to cause harm or loss. Hazard increases the impact of hazard but can create an accident. That means it works as an agent that poses a threat to people, property, and the environment. A hazard can take many forms. For instance, it can be a substance, an energy source, or an existing work practice or process. Types of hazards can be physical hazards, such as slippery floors, chemical hazards, toxic substances, biological hazards, disease-causing agents, or related to other factors such as noise, radiation, and so on. Hazards can be present in any workplace, and it is essential to identify them and take necessary steps to control or eliminate them. Types of hazards. There are three basic types of hazards: physical, moral, and moral. 1. Physical hazards. These are hazards associated with the physical condition and increase the chances of loss. 2. Moral hazards. These hazards are related to human characteristics likely to affect the outcome. These can be disloyalty or biases of a person that increase the probability of loss. 3. Moral hazard. This is an injured person's attitude towards their belongings. A moral hazard is a person's carelessness, which occurs due to the presence of insurance. What is a risk? Risk refers to the probability or likelihood of harm due to exposure to a hazard. Risk is the combination of the likelihood and severity of the harm that may result. Hence, the standard definition of risk is the combination of a specific hazard and the likelihood that the hazard occurs. The level of risk can vary depending on various factors, such as the level of exposure, the vulnerability of the person exposed, and the effectiveness of control measures in place. There are two aspects of risks: the probability of harm occurring and the severity of the damage. Therefore, the risk results from the likelihood of an event and its severity. Likelihood may be expressed as a rate or a probability. For example, the risk of a fire outbreak, that is, hazard, in a factory can be expressed as 1 accident per million of loss or damages caused by fire, that is, likelihood. Risk can be objectively defined so that two people can take the same data and produce a similar result. Risk can be expressed in several ways, but it must be expressed in a way that combines a hazard with a likelihood. Key differences between hazards and risks. It is essential to note the difference between hazards and risks. A hazard can cause harm, including work accidents, emergencies, toxic chemicals, employee conflicts, and stress. A risk, on the other hand, is the chance that a hazard will cause harm. As part of a risk assessment plan, the company will first identify potential hazards and then calculate the risk or likelihood of those hazards occurring. This means that a hazard could cause harm, while the risk is the degree of likelihood or probability that a hazard will cause damage. A hazard can cause harm. Risk is how likely it is to do so. The two terms work together when assessing the working environment for potential dangers and prioritizing them effectively. In summary, here are the key differences between hazards and risks. 1. Hazard implies an agent that can cause harm, danger or loss. Risk is the probability of harm or danger when exposed to a hazard. 2. Hazard denotes the anticipated cause of harm, while risk indicates anticipation of harm. 3. Hazards are related to physical objects, situations or settings that threaten life, property or anything else. Risks are associated with an action or inaction that might endanger life, property or anything else. 4. It is impossible to measure hazard in degrees, but you can easily measure the risk of something in degrees, high or low. Practical examples of hazards and risks. Risk is a combination of two things, the chance that the hazard will cause harm and how severe that harm could be. Risk is usually described as high, medium or low. Hazard and risk are often used interchangeably, but simple examples explain the difference. If there were a water spill in a room, that water would present a slipping hazard to persons passing through it. If a physical barrier prevents access to that area, the hazard would remain, but the risk would be minimized. The physical barrier preventing access has reduced the likelihood of harm, but the hazard still exists or remains. Here is another example. Think about a person crossing a road. Cars and other traffic are the main hazards. The person's mental calculation of the risk is a combination of how likely he will be hit by a car and how seriously he might be injured. Some things could affect the likelihood of the person being hit by a vehicle, and some things could also affect the severity of injury sustained. In our example, the speed of the traffic, the person's speed and fitness, the weather conditions, the road surface, and the time of day could affect the likelihood of being hit. Likewise, the vehicle's size, roadworthiness and speed could affect the severity of the injury sustained by the person. Risk management helps in managing risk. Hazards must be identified, assessed, controlled, or eliminated to prevent harm. Risk assessment evaluates the likelihood and severity of harm that could result from exposure to a hazard. Based on this assessment, control measures can be implemented to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. Consequently, identifying hazards and assessing risks is essential to implement effective control measures and ensure a safe and healthy workplace. What is risk management? Risk management entails identifying, analyzing, evaluating, treating loss exposures and monitoring risk control to mitigate the adverse effects of loss. Risk management helps organizations identify, evaluate, or assess, analyze, or measure, treat and monitor potential risks. Risk management helps an organization identify, assess and monitor its risk to minimize possible adverse effects. Risk management is a continuous process that helps organizations identify potential risks in their operations, assess their potential impact, and develop strategies to mitigate or eliminate them. It includes identifying, assessing, controlling, and monitoring organizational risks. It also includes developing plans to reduce the impact of risks and preparing for how to respond if they occur. It helps organizations prepare and respond to potential risks efficiently and effectively. Risk assessment and risk analysis are part of a risk management process. To ensure a thorough understanding of the two terms, let us discuss risk assessment and risk analysis before differentiating between the two terms. What is risk assessment? Risk assessment helps an organization to determine the likelihood of a risk occurring and its potential impact. It entails analyzing, evaluating, and reporting the risks associated with a given activity, project, or process. Risk assessment aims to understand the potential losses or damages that could occur due to an event and develop strategies to reduce or eliminate the risks. It helps organizations make better decisions by providing them with an understanding of the risks and an action plan to address those risks. Risk assessment consists of three essential components: identification, analysis, and evaluation. In risk identification, leaders and employees must be aware of the different risk possibilities present in the workplace. Risk analysis takes the assessment a step further. It is about understanding the consequences of potential risks and their impacts on the organization. Risk evaluation is about categorizing the risks based on the severity, that is, the possibility of the risk becoming a reality. Risk assessment is a subset of risk management. While risk management is a continuous process that involves identifying, analyzing, and responding to risks, risk assessment focuses on identifying and assessing all potential risks to an organization's operation. Why is risk assessment important? Risk assessments are critical as they are integral to a risk management framework. They help to 1. Create awareness of hazards and risks. 2. Identify who may be at risk, for example, employees, visitors, contractors, the public. 3. Determine whether a control program is required for a particular hazard. 4. Determine if existing control measures are adequate or if more should be done. 5. Prevent injuries or illnesses, especially at the design or planning stage, for example occupational health and safety hazards. 6. Prioritize hazards and control measures. And 7. Meet legal requirements where applicable. What is the goal of risk assessment? The risk assessment process aims to evaluate hazards, remove them, or minimize their risk level by adding control measures as necessary. The essence of a risk assessment is to ensure a healthy organization and safe workplace. During the risk assessment process, the organization must review and evaluate 2. 1. Identify processes and situations that may cause harm, particularly to people. This constitutes hazard identification. 2. Determine how likely each hazard will occur and how severe the consequences would be. This constitutes risk analysis and evaluation. 3. Decide what steps the organization can take to stop these hazards from occurring or control the risk when the hazard cannot be eliminated. This constitutes a risk control. The goal of a risk assessment will vary across industries, but overall, the goal is to help organizations prepare for and combat risk. Other goals include 1. Providing an analysis of possible threats. 2. Preventing injuries or illnesses. 3. Meeting legal requirements. 4. Creating awareness about hazards and risks. 5. Creating an accurate inventory of available assets. 6. Justifying the costs of managing risks. 7. Determining the budget to remediate risks. And 8. Understanding the return on investment. Businesses should perform a risk assessment before introducing new processes or activities, changes to existing operations or activities, such as changing machinery, or when the company identifies a new hazard. The steps used in a risk assessment are integral to the organization's health and safety management plan and ensure the organization is prepared to handle any risk. Consequently, the goal of a risk assessment is to answer the following questions. 1. What can happen, and under what circumstances? 2. What are the possible consequences? 3. How likely are the potential impacts? And 4. Is the risk controlled effectively, or is further action required? When should a risk assessment be done? There are several reasons a risk assessment is necessary, including before new processes or activities are introduced. Before introducing new processes or activities, products, machinery, tools, equipment change, or new information regarding possible threats. When new hazards are identified. Preparing for a risk assessment. Before an organization starts the risk management process, it is essential to determine the scope of the assessment, necessary resources, stakeholders involved, and laws and regulations of the risk assessment process. Let us briefly explain these features. 1. Scope. Define the processes, activities, functions, and physical locations included within the risk assessment. The scope of the assessment impacts the time and resources required to complete it, so it is essential to outline what is included for planning and budgeting purposes. 2. Resources. What resources will be needed for the risk assessment? This includes the time, personnel, and financial resources required to develop, implement, and manage the risk assessment. 3. Stakeholders. Who is involved in the risk assessment? In addition to the top management, the company must constitute an assessment team. Designate who will fill critical roles such as risk manager, assessment team leader, risk assessors, and any subject matter experts. 4. Laws and regulations. Different industries will have specific rules and legal requirements governing risk and work hazards. For instance, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, and Health and Safety Executive, HSE, set and enforce working condition standards for the organization. The organization should plan its assessment to ensure compliance, subject to applicable regulations. Risk assessment process. The risk assessment process consists of 5 steps. Proceed with these 5 steps. Let us discuss the 5 steps of a risk assessment process. Step 1. Identify the hazards. The first step to creating a risk assessment is to determine what hazards the business and its employees face, including natural disasters, for example, flooding, tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, and fire. Biological hazards, for example, pandemic diseases, foodborne illnesses, and waterborne diseases. Workplace accidents, for example, transportation accidents, structural failure, slips and trips, and mechanical breakdowns. Intentional acts, for example, labor strikes, arson, demonstrations, bomb threats, and robbery. Technological hazards, for example, lost internet connection and power outage. Chemical hazards. Mental hazards, for example, excess workload, discrimination and bullying. Logistics and supply chain interruptions. Inspecting the company's workplace to ascertain processes or activities that harm the organization is essential. All aspects of work, including remote workers and non-routine activities such as repair and maintenance, should be assessed. Records of past incidents should also be revisited to ascertain what hazards have impacted the company. Step 2. Determine who might be harmful and how. As assess the organization, consider how business activities or external factors could harm the company's employees. For every hazard identified in Step 1, think about who will be injured should the hazard occur. Step 3. Evaluate the risks and highlight necessary precautions. Evaluate the risks identified and highlight necessary precautions to eliminate or reduce their consequences. The company needs to consider how likely the hazard will occur and how severe the consequences will be if that hazard occurs. This evaluation will help the organization determine where it should reduce the level of risk and which hazards should be prioritized first. Step 4. Recording of findings. The company must document its risk assessment process, often called a risk assessment plan. The risk assessment plan should include the hazards identified, the people affected, and the plan to mitigate the hazards. The risk assessment plan must be written to demonstrate that the company conducted a proper check of its workspace, determined who would be affected, controlled and dealt with obvious hazards, initiated precautions to keep risks low, and take care of the staff involved in the process. Step 5. Monitor and review the risk assessment plan. The risk assessment plan must be monitored and reviewed regularly. The workplace is constantly changing, so the risks to a firm also change. As new equipment, processes, and people are introduced, each brings the risk of a new hazard. Hence, reviewing and updating the risk assessment process to capture new hazards is essential. Having discussed risk assessment, let us proceed to discuss risk analysis. What is risk analysis? Risk analysis is the broader assessment process that evaluates a firm's risk components and consequences. Risk analysis quantifies risk by calculating the probability and severity of a loss. Risk analysis is the process of measuring and quantifying risk. It involves estimating the potential losses and their sequences. Risk analysis is integral to risk management as it helps organizations make informed decisions to reduce or eliminate risks. It also helps organizations identify potential sources of losses and develop strategies to reduce their exposure to those sources. Risk analysis is taking the risk assessment process to the next level. Risk analysis uses understanding the risks identified at the initial stage of a risk management process to determine the magnitude of damage they might cause to an organization. By understanding the potential risks and developing a plan to address them, organizations can better prepare for and respond to potential losses. Why is risk analysis important? Enterprises and other organizations use risk analysis to anticipate and reduce the effect of harmful results from adverse events. Evaluate whether the potential risks of a project are balanced by its benefits to aid in the decision process when evaluating whether to move forward with the project. Plan responses for technology or equipment failure or loss from adverse events, both natural and human-caused, and identify the impact of and prepare for changes in the enterprise environment, including the likelihood of new competitors entering the market or changes to government regulatory policy. What are the benefits of risk analysis? Organizations must understand the risks associated with using their activities to effectively and efficiently protect their information assets. Risk analysis can help an organization improve its security in several ways. The focus of the analysis and the format of the results will vary depending on the type of risk analysis. Risk analysis is a crucial tool for managing costs and making well-informed decisions. Depending on the type and extent of the risk analysis, organizations can use the results to help identify, rate and compare the overall impact of risks, financial and non-financial, on the organization. Identify gaps in security and determine the next steps to eliminate the weaknesses and strengthen security. Enhance communication and decision-making processes within an organization. Improve organizational policies and procedures and develop cost-effective methods for implementing policies and procedures. Put security controls in place to mitigate the most critical risks. Increase employee awareness about security measures and risks by highlighting best practices during the risk analysis process, and understand the financial impacts of potential security risks. To get into the practicality of risk analysis, it is essential to analyze and score each risk using one of the two main ways of risk analysis, quantitative and qualitative. Qualitative versus quantitative risk analysis. The two main approaches to risk analysis are qualitative and quantitative. Let us describe quantitative and qualitative risk analysis and discuss the difference. Quantitative risk analysis. Quantitative risk analysis entails quantifying a firm's risks in monetary terms, the impacts each threat poses, and ranks them based on consequences to the organization's activity. A qualitative risk analysis is subjective because it ascertains risk severity by predicting the likelihood and impact of a risk. Risks are usually presented in a risk assessment matrix, which is then used to explain risks to relevant stakeholders. Due to their lack of numerical estimates, this risk assessment method is the most effective but is typically challenging to fund or budget. Qualitative risk analysis. Qualitative risk analysis is subjective, depending on the organization's structure, industry and risk assessment goals. The likelihood, impact, rate and severity of a risk occurring are used as a scoring mechanism in qualitative risk analysis. A quantitative risk analysis is objective. It relies on data, which is used to analyze risk to budget, deadline overruns, scope creep, and resource overruns. A quantitative risk analysis deals with numbers. Hence, it is limited depending on the available data. The difference between qualitative and quantitative risk analysis. Qualitative risk analysis typically means assessing the likelihood of a risk occurring based on subjective qualities and its impact on an organization using predefined ranking scales. The impact of risks is often categorized into three: low, medium or high. The probability that a risk will occur can also be expressed the same way or classified as the likelihood it will happen, ranging from 0% to 100%. Quantitative risk analysis, on the other hand, attempts to assign a specific monetary amount to adverse events, representing the potential cost to an organization if that event occurs and the likelihood that the event will happen in a given year. In other words, if the anticipated cost of a significant cyber attack is $50 million and the likelihood of the attack occurring in the current year is 10%, that risk would be $5 million for that year. A qualitative risk analysis produces subjective results using the data collected from participants in the risk analysis process based on their perceptions of the probability of a risk and the risk's likely consequences. Categorizing risks in this way helps organizations decide between low priority and high priority risks to reduce the consequences on organizations. In contrast, a quantitative risk analysis examines a project's overall risk and is generally conducted after a qualitative risk analysis. The quantitative risk analysis numerically analyzes the probability of each risk and its consequences. A quantitative risk analysis aims to associate a specific monetary amount to each risk that has been identified, representing the potential cost to an organization if that risk occurs. An organization that has done a quantitative risk analysis and was affected by a data breach should be able to quickly determine the financial impact of the incident on its operations. Quantitative risk analysis provides an organization with more objective information and data than qualitative analysis, thereby ensuring well-informed decision-making. Steps in the risk analysis process. Risk analysis involves collecting, analyzing, and interpreting data from various sources to understand the potential risks. The risk analysis process consists of the following 6 basic steps. Step 1. Conduct a risk assessment survey. The risk assessment survey is a good way of collecting data to document specific risks or threats within each department. This is the first and critical step of a risk analysis process. It entails getting input from the management and department heads, which is essential for the success of the risk assessment process. This may include examining historical data, conducting surveys or interviews with stakeholders, and analyzing industry trends. Risk analysis also involves assessing how factors, including technology, regulations, and the changing environment, affect the firm's risk levels. Step 2. Identify the risks. The risk assessment evaluates the organization's activity to identify its risk exposures. What adverse events, such as human error, fire, flooding and earthquakes, could occur? What is the potential that the integrity of the company's operations will be compromised or ineffective? Step 3. Analysis of the risk. After identifying risk, it is likely to understand and assess the extent and nature of risk that is most likely to happen and to what extent it may occur to the organization shall be analyzed. Once the risks are identified, the risk analysis process should determine the likelihood of each risk, the consequences linked to each risk, and how they might affect the organization's goals. Step 4. Evaluate the risk. Analyzing risk helps a firm estimate the capacity of risk that may happen. Hence, in evaluating the risk, the team must rank the calculated risk to decide whether to accept the risk. Based on analyzing which assets are valuable and which threats will affect those assets negatively, the risk analysis should produce control recommendations that can be used to mitigate, transfer, accept or avoid the risk. The evaluation results can then be used to develop strategies for reducing or eliminating those risks. Step 5. Treat the risk. The ultimate goal of risk assessment is to implement measures to eliminate or minimize the risks. If the risk is accepted, the organization will treat or resolve the issue by modifying changes required in its operations or the project. Starting with the highest priority risk is beneficial to appropriately resolve or mitigate each risk. At this stage, the management must decide whether to eliminate, transfer or continue retaining the risk. The risk must be treated appropriately based on the selected risk treatment strategy. Step 6. Monitor the risk. As the risk is uncertain at any point, reviewing risk is essential to evaluate the firm's risks to avoid future disturbances regularly. This is necessary because identifying, treating and managing risks ensures a good risk analysis process. After discussing risk assessment and analysis, let us highlight the differences between risk assessment and risk analysis. Key differences between risk analysis and risk assessment. Risk management entails assessing, analyzing, prioritizing, and developing a strategy for mitigating threats and managing risk to an organization's assets and earnings. Risk assessment is a process within risk management. It aims to break down threats into identifiable categories and define each risk's potential impact. Risk analysis is part of an overall risk assessment process involving measuring an organization's risks and consequences. Risk assessment is a more extensive process that includes running analyses, identifying the options to remediate the risk, and reporting to stakeholders. A risk assessment might also encompass multiple risk analyses covering, for instance, the loss exposure for a specific business unit. When risk analysis is completed, and risks have been scored using suitable metrics, the risks should be prioritized and categorized based on their priority and how quickly the firm needs to develop mitigation processes to respond to them. The implication is that risk assessment constitutes part of a broader risk assessment process. Consequently, risk analysis is the crucial evaluation component within an overall risk assessment process. This is because scoring the risks identified considers the likelihood of occurrence and the estimated extent of potential impact. This makes prioritizing risks and setting a strategy for mitigating them possible. Conclusion. This video has discussed the difference between risk assessment and risk analysis. Risk assessment and risk analysis are all critical components of a sound risk management system. However, they each have distinct meanings and functions. Risk management involves identifying, assessing, and prioritizing risks, and then implementing measures to mitigate or control those risks. Risk assessment determines how likely it is that something bad will happen and what the consequences could be. It involves understanding the nature of the risk, its causes, and possible outcomes. Risk analysis is the process of gathering and evaluating information to understand the level of risk associated with a particular situation or event. This involves identifying potential threats and vulnerabilities, assessing the possible impact of those threats, and determining the likelihood that they will occur. I hope this video is educative and beneficial to you. Kindly post your comments below in the comments section. If this video has been educative and beneficial, give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Thank you for seeing the Solomon Fadun, Risk Management of Everything videos. I love to hear from you. Kindly post your comments and questions in the comment section below. If you are new here, subscribe to the channel, Solomon Fadun, Risk Management of Everything channel, and press the notification button to be notified when new videos are uploaded. Thank you.